The courtroom was buzzing with low murmurs as people settled into the wooden benches. Some shuffled papers, others tapped their feet nervously, and a few stared blankly at the high ceiling, as if hoping the walls would somehow answer their questions. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the room. At the front, the judge, a man with a stern face and a booming voice, sat behind the large desk, his robe making him look even taller and more intimidating. His eyes scanned the room like a hawk, stopping occasionally on the people seated below him. Among the crowd sat a teenager. At first glance, anyone could have thought she was just another student slightly nervous, wearing simple clothes, carrying a small backpack. She seemed quiet, almost timid, as she kept her hands folded in her lap. But behind her calm exterior, her mind was racing. Every sound, every movement in the courtroom was being noted, analyzed. She knew that every word she said, every gesture she made, could be judged harshly. She had been here before, in her own mind, countless times, imagining how the courtroom would feel, how people would react. And she had prepared herself for this moment in ways no one could imagine. The case was small. Minor dispute, but that didn't mean it was simple. The teenager had unintentionally been involved in something that had caught the attention of the authorities. It was one of those situations where a small mistake could spiral into a bigger problem if it wasn't handled correctly. The judge, however, seemed to think the whole matter was trivial. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, and let out a sigh that seemed designed to make the teenager feel even smaller. "Come on. We don't have all day," the judge said, his voice carrying that sharp edge that made people flinch. "Let's get this over with. You understand what you're being accused of, right?" The teenager nodded politely. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she waited for the right moment, listening carefully. The judge frowned slightly, clearly expecting her to stammer or show signs of uncertainty. When nothing of the sort happened, he tapped his pen impatiently and raised an eyebrow. "You're quiet," he said, leaning forward. "Don't think you can just sit there and hope this will go away. Answer me clearly. Do you understand what this is about?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied calmly, her voice steady and surprisingly clear. "I understand what this is about. I also understand the consequences, which is why I want to explain my side carefully." The judge let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You're young," he said, almost mockingly. "I've been doing this for decades. You're not going to teach me anything about the law. Just say what you did, and we'll be done." Most people in the courtroom would have shrunk under such words. Most teenagers would have fumbled, stuttered, or even burst into tears under the weight of such condescension. But she didn't. She didn't feel angry, at least not in a way that would show. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. She had prepared for this. Every argument, every question that could possibly come her way, she had thought about. And she knew that patience and clarity were her best tools. She waited until the judge had leaned back and seemed to have dismissed her entirely. Then she spoke again, carefully choosing her words. "Your Honor, I respect your experience. I know you've seen cases much more complicated than mine. But I believe there are some points here that need attention because they affect the facts directly. If I may, I would like to explain them." There was a brief pause. The judge's eyes narrowed. It was clear he wasn't used to someone her age speaking with such confidence or such tact. He had expected fear, hesitation, maybe even a little nervous mumbling. Instead, he was met with calm assurance. "Fine," he said finally, his tone clipped. "Go ahead, but make it quick. We have other matters to attend to." The teenager nodded and took a slow breath. She began by outlining the situation clearly, without drama, without exaggeration. She spoke in short, precise sentences, making sure every point was easy to follow. She explained what had happened, step by step, and highlighted the small misunderstandings that had led to the current situation. She made no excuses, but she did provide context. As she spoke, she noticed the subtle changes in the room. People who had been leaning back in their chairs, distracted, were now leaning forward. The judge, who had initially been tapping his pen impatiently, was now frowning slightly, listening more carefully than before. Even the lawyers seemed to be taking notes. whispering quietly to each other. It wasn't arrogance or a desire to show off that guided her words, it was clarity. She wanted the truth to be understood, and she wanted it presented logically. That simple approach, combined with her careful observation of the room, gave her a quiet authority. The judge interrupted her once, attempting to belittle her again. "You think you understand this better than we do?" he said sharply. "You're a child. This is grown-up business." She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't claim to know more than anyone here. But I do know the facts of my own experience, and I believe they are important to consider fully." For a moment, the judge was silent. It was the first time anyone could remember seeing him genuinely caught off guard. Most people had either cowered or become defensive under his tone. But she simply spoke truthfully, without hostility, without fear. As she continued, she carefully addressed each point the judge had raised, answering questions with precision. She didn't rush, and she didn't let the judge's attitude shake her. She knew that the law was based on facts and evidence, not on age or appearances. And she made sure that every word she spoke reinforced that idea. By the time she finished her explanation, a noticeable shift had occurred in the courtroom. Some people were whispering to each other in surprise. The judge cleared his throat, as if trying to regain control, but there was a new respect in his eyes, subtle but undeniable. The teenager had done more than defend herself. She had earned attention simply by being calm, prepared, and articulate. She gathered her papers and glanced around the room, noting the small reactions, the raised eyebrows, the nods of understanding, the way a few people were leaning forward as if seeing her in a completely new light. It was a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. The judge leaned back, folding his hands. "Well," he said slowly, "you've made your points clear. That is impressive for someone your age." She nodded politely. "Thank you, Your Honor. I just wanted to ensure the facts were understood." And with that, she sat back, allowing the room to settle. The tension had shifted. What had begun as a courtroom dominated by assumptions and condescension was now a room where people had to acknowledge her intelligence, her preparation, and her calm demeanor. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, and the shadows had shifted again. But inside that courtroom, a small but significant change had taken place. A teenager, underestimated and belittled, had shown quietly but powerfully that age and appearances don't determine capability. As she waited for the next steps, she reflected on the experience. She knew this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges, more skeptics, and more moments when people assumed they were smarter than her simply because of how she looked. But she felt ready. She had discovered a strength in herself that day, a strength that came from preparation, observation, and confidence in her own mind. And as the murmurs of the courtroom continued, she couldn't help but smile just a little. She had faced a room full of adults who thought they knew better, and she had made them listen. That moment, small as it seemed to others, felt monumental to her. It was the moment she realized that respect doesn't have to be demanded. It can be earned, quietly, through intellect, poise, and the courage to speak clearly even when the world expects silence. The judge sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk in front of him. He didn't speak immediately. There was a pause in the courtroom, a moment of stillness where the only sound was the faint shuffle of papers. The teenager, her hands still folded neatly in her lap, could feel the weight of his gaze upon her, but she didn't let it shake her. She was calm, confident. She had said her piece, and she had said it well. Now it was time to see how the judge would respond. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might just dismiss her argument entirely. He had been used to people his whole career crumbling under his sharp tone, his authority. People generally didn't argue back, especially not a young teenager who seemed so out of place in a courtroom full of professionals. The judge had assumed she wouldn't have the strength to keep up in a space where legal expertise and experience reigned. But this one was different. The teenager was unfazed, almost detached in her composure, as if she had no intention of getting pulled into any power struggles. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. His voice was colder now, his tone sharper. "So, you think you can just waltz in here and lecture me on the facts of this case?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "You're not a lawyer and certainly not someone with any real experience in the matter at hand. What makes you think your opinion matters?" The courtroom grew quiet again. The judge's words were cutting, designed to intimidate. It was the kind of statement people usually recoiled from, but the teenager didn't flinch. She didn't lower her gaze, didn't shuffle in her seat, or even look nervous. Instead, she sat still, her expression calm, almost unbothered. She knew exactly what she was doing. "I don't claim to have the experience you do, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "But I do know the facts of the situation, and I think it's important to consider them before making any judgments. I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here to make sure that the truth comes out clearly. It's what the law requires." The judge paused again, his face unreadable for a moment. A slight flicker of confusion crossed his features, but it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, not in his courtroom. He was used to people nodding nervously, agreeing with whatever he said. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially by someone who seemed like they had no business doing so. "You really think this case is about the truth?" he asked, leaning forward now, his tone more mocking than before. "It's a small matter, one that doesn't deserve all this attention. I don't think you understand how things work in a courtroom. We don't have time for detailed explanations. Just stick to the basics. Tell me what happened, and let's wrap this up." The teenager didn't rush to speak this time. She took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts, making sure to choose her words carefully. She understood that the judge was trying to dismiss her, to make her feel like she didn't belong. But she had been waiting for this moment for far too long to be pushed aside now. "I understand that you may think this isn't worth much attention," she began, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone of quiet conviction. "But for me, this is important. And I believe it's important to make sure every detail is considered, especially when it comes to fairness. You see, Your Honor, it's easy to overlook things when you don't know the full picture. But that's exactly why I'm here to provide that perspective." The judge's face hardened. He clearly wasn't used to someone, especially a teenager, speaking so assertively in his courtroom. It was obvious to everyone in the room now that he was becoming uncomfortable, unsure how to respond to the girl's calm confidence. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, then back at her, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're wasting everyone's time," he muttered under his breath. "If you think you can impress me with your perspective, you're sorely mistaken. This is a simple matter. It's nothing more than a misunderstanding. No need to make it more complicated than it is." The teenager let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "Perhaps it seems simple to you, Your Honor, but I don't think it's quite that clear-cut. There's more to this than what meets the eye. And I'm just asking that the full context is understood before any decisions are made." At this point, the entire courtroom was watching her. The lawyers, the witnesses, the few people in the back rows, all of them had fallen silent, their attention fixed on the teenager who had somehow managed to hold her ground against the judge. It was strange, almost surreal, the way she seemed to challenge his authority without raising her voice or losing her composure. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. He was clearly frustrated, but he wasn't going to let a teenager outsmart him in front of an audience. His authority, after all, was at stake. But still, something in the back of his mind nagged at him. He wasn't used to this level of resistance. He had been doing this job for decades, and the routine was always the same. People spoke when they were told to, answered when they were prompted, and cowered when they were intimidated. But she wasn't playing by the same rules. She was different. "Enough," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was trying to reassert control. "Let's get on with this. You've said your piece, but I still don't see why we need to make such a big deal out of this. It's just a small mistake, a minor inconvenience. Let's move on." The teenager didn't react to his tone. She simply nodded as if she understood the underlying frustration. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. She wasn't naive enough to believe that the judge would just back down. But she had a plan. She had prepared for this moment, and she knew exactly what she needed to say next. "If I may, Your Honor," she said softly. "I'd like to draw your attention to a few specific details in the evidence that I believe haven't been fully considered." Her calm, measured voice made the judge pause. He raised an eyebrow. It was almost like she was speaking to him as an equal, which unsettled him even further. The other people in the room were beginning to take note, too. No one had expected her to come back so strongly after being dismissed. It was as if she had been waiting for the right moment. And now that moment had arrived. The teenager slowly reached into her bag and pulled out a file. She didn't rush through the papers, instead taking her time to ensure each point was clear. As she spoke, she began to outline the discrepancies she had noticed. She explained how the evidence presented against her didn't align with what had actually happened, pointing out contradictions and offering alternative explanations that no one had considered before Dashi spoke. The judge's expression began to shift. He had expected her to stumble, to lose track of her argument, to fall apart under pressure. But she didn't. Every point she made was logical, concise, and well supported. The more she spoke, the more the courtroom seemed to shift in her favor. The atmosphere was changing. People were starting to see her for what she really was, not a scared teenager, but someone who had done her homework, someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. The judge, though reluctant to admit it, was starting to realize that he had misjudged her. At first, he had seen her as just a kid who didn't belong in a courtroom. But now, he was beginning to see something else, something he couldn't ignore. The teenager was smart. She was prepared. And she was challenging him in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time since the trial began, the judge fell silent. He sat back in his chair, his fingers no longer tapping, his eyes no longer glaring. He was watching her now, truly listening as the teenager continued to lay out her case. And despite himself, a small part of him began to respect her not for her age, not for her appearance, but for her intelligence and her ability to hold her own in the face of authority. The courtroom was almost eerily quiet now. The judge, who had been so quick to dismiss the teenager earlier, now seemed to be lost in thought. His fingers, once tapping impatiently on the desk, were now resting still, as if waiting for something to happen. The air had changed. It wasn't just the quiet, though. It was the shift in the way the people around her were looking at the teenager. Some of them were starting to whisper among themselves, glancing over at the girl with a mix of curiosity and respect. Others were just staring at her, watching as she continued to present her case with clarity and precision. The teenager didn't seem to notice the change in the atmosphere around her. She wasn't looking for validation, nor was she concerned about the way people might view her. She was focused. Her eyes were steady, her hands moving across the pages of her notes with confidence. Every word she spoke was measured, thoughtful, and deliberate. She wasn't just answering questions anymore, she was taking control of the situation. The judge, though visibly uncomfortable, seemed to be paying attention now. He sat back in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by something closer to doubt. It was clear he hadn't expected her to be so thorough, so articulate. In fact, he had expected her to falter at some point, to lose her cool, to show signs of the nervousness that most young people would have displayed in this situation. But she hadn't. She had remained composed and sharp, each sentence she spoke building upon the last. "I'd like to point out, Your Honor," the teenager continued, "that the evidence presented in this case doesn't fully reflect the situation. There are key elements that have been overlooked, and they're crucial in understanding what happened. I'm not saying I'm completely innocent, but I believe there are misunderstandings that need to be addressed before any conclusions are drawn." The judge didn't interrupt her this time. He merely nodded, though his expression was still guarded. The way he was sitting now, leaning forward slightly, showed that he was at least listening. This was new. It wasn't often that someone so young could hold his attention like this, especially not someone with so little experience in a courtroom. The teenager was in the middle of explaining one of the key points when a lawyer seated across from her leaned forward, his pen poised above his notepad. "If I may," he said, breaking the silence, "I'm not sure I follow. You're suggesting that the evidence is inaccurate, but you haven't provided anything concrete to back that up. What exactly are you implying?" The teenager met his gaze without hesitation. I'm implying that the evidence has been misinterpreted. The timing of certain events doesn't match up with what's been claimed. If we take a closer look at the timeline, it becomes clear that there are gaps. Gaps that suggest things happened differently than the prosecution is presenting them. The courtroom was still as everyone took in her words. The lawyer, who had been so eager to dismiss her earlier, was now silent. He glanced at his notes, then looked up at the judge. For the first time, it seemed like he was questioning his own assumptions. The teenager didn't wait for him to respond. She kept going. The witness testimony, she said, is also a bit inconsistent. At one point, the witness claims to have seen me in a certain location at a specific time, but the details don't add up. There are conflicting reports from other witnesses who were there at the same time. It's important that all the testimonies are considered, not just the one that fits the narrative being pushed. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're saying that the witnesses are lying? His voice was skeptical, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes now. He wasn't fully convinced, but he was willing to listen. I'm not saying they're lying, the teenager replied calmly. What I'm saying is that their memories may be flawed, or they may have misunderstood what they saw. People are unreliable, especially under pressure. That's why we rely on facts, not just recollections. That's why I'm asking that we examine everything carefully before making any judgments. The room was silent for a few moments. The judge sat still, his expression hard to read. He didn't speak right away, but the tension in the room was palpable. The teenager had just delivered a point that no one else had thought to challenge, and it was clear that her argument was gaining traction. Finally, the judge spoke, though his voice was quieter now, less authoritative. All right, he said slowly. Let's take a look at what you're suggesting. We'll review the evidence again. But you're going to have to prove that these discrepancies are significant enough to change the outcome of the case. The teenager nodded, not looking triumphant, but calm. I understand, Your Honor. I just want to make sure everything is fully understood, that's all. At this point, the room seemed to shift. The lawyers, who had been so confident in their own arguments earlier, were now quietly consulting with one another. The whispers had grown louder, and there was a clear sense of uncertainty among them. The teenager had thrown them off balance. They weren't expecting someone like her, someone so young, someone so composed and articulate, to present an argument so well-structured and well thought out. The judge, though still holding on to his authority, seemed to be reconsidering his initial stance. His usual calm, steady demeanor was replaced by something less certain. He cleared his throat again, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. We'll review the evidence, he repeated, though his tone wasn't as dismissive as it had been earlier. But you're going to have to explain all of this in more detail. I'm happy to, Your Honor, she replied, her voice unwavering. I've prepared everything I need to present. For the next few minutes, the teenager calmly and systematically went through the key points she had made earlier. She didn't rush, didn't stumble. She explained each piece of evidence, offering her analysis of why it was either misinterpreted or overlooked. As she spoke, the judge seemed to soften, his earlier defensiveness melting away. The more she presented, the clearer it became that her understanding of the case was deeper than anyone had initially thought. The lawyers, who had once seemed so confident, were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They hadn't expected her to come so prepared. They hadn't expected her to challenge their evidence so effectively. And though they were still trying to keep their cool, there was no denying that her words were having an impact. As the teenager finished her presentation, she looked up at the judge, waiting for his response. The courtroom was still, the only sound the occasional rustle of papers as the judge flipped through his notes. He sat in silence for a few long moments, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, finally, he spoke. I have to admit, he said, his voice quieter now, I wasn't expecting you to present such a thorough argument. It's clear you've put a lot of thought into this. The teenager nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. I just want to make sure the facts are understood. There was another long pause before the judge spoke again. We'll review the evidence carefully. I won't make any decisions today, but we'll take your points into consideration. The teenager didn't say anything in response. She simply nodded again, her expression calm. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was progress. She had come into this courtroom expecting to be dismissed, expecting people to underestimate her. But now, for the first time, the judge had acknowledged her argument. He hadn't dismissed her out of hand. And that, in itself, was a small victory. As the proceedings came to a close for the day, the teenager stood up, gathering her things. She didn't feel overconfident, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had managed to make the judge and everyone else in the room listen. The courtroom, once filled with skepticism and doubt, had shifted. She had changed the narrative, if only slightly, and she knew that the next time she returned, it would be different. As she walked out of the courtroom, she felt a sense of pride in herself. Not because she had won, not yet anyway, but because she had stood her ground, maintained her composure, and made her voice heard. In that moment, she realized something important. Sometimes the greatest victories don't come from defeating others, but from showing them that you deserve to be heard. The following week, the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. As soon as the teenager entered the room, she felt it. There was a shift in the air, something subtle but noticeable. The usual tension was still there, but it wasn't the same as before. People who had once whispered or stared were now looking at her with a kind of quiet respect. Even the lawyers, who had seemed so eager to dismiss her the last time, were giving her more space, more consideration. She took her seat, folding her hands in her lap, and waited for the proceedings to begin. She could feel the judge's eyes on her as he walked into the room, and for the first time she saw a slight change in his demeanor. He wasn't the same judge who had sat at the desk the week before, confident in his assumptions and quick to dismiss her. Now there was a subtle shift in his posture, something that told her he was prepared to listen more carefully this time. He cleared his throat as he settled into his seat. "We've had some time to go over the evidence again, and I must say some of the points you raised last time are concerning," he said, his tone still stern but lacking the sharpness it had had before. "I can't deny that you've made some valid observations, and I want to be sure we're all on the same page before moving forward." The teenager felt a small rush of relief, but she didn't let it show. She knew this was just the beginning of the real challenge. The courtroom was still a place of authority, and though there had been a shift in the judge's attitude, she was still in the middle of a legal battle. "This was no time to get too comfortable. I appreciate that you've taken the time to review the evidence," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I just want to make sure we're not missing any important details and that the facts are being properly considered." The judge nodded, a slight sign of respect in his gesture. He wasn't going to make it easy for her, but he was clearly acknowledging that she had made a strong case. "I've asked the prosecution and defense to re-examine the points you raised, and they're here today to offer any additional information or corrections," he said, gesturing to the lawyers sitting across from her. "But I want to hear from you as well. This is your chance to address any remaining questions, so please, continue." The teenager nodded, her thoughts already organizing themselves. She wasn't nervous anymore. She had done her homework, prepared for every possible question, and had come to this moment with a clear purpose. She knew what needed to be said and how to say it. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about presenting the truth. She stood up slowly, taking a deep breath as she glanced at the judge, then at the other lawyers. "Your Honor, I want to revisit one of the key points I made last week. It's about the timeline of events. If we examine the sequence closely, we can see that there are inconsistencies in the way the events have been portrayed. The prosecution's argument relies heavily on the timing, but the evidence doesn't match their version of what happened." The courtroom was silent as she began to lay out her points again. She spoke methodically, walking the judge and the lawyers through the evidence step by step. She referenced the specific documents, pointing to timestamps and key moments that contradicted the claims made by the prosecution. She didn't rush. She wanted every detail to be absorbed. The prosecution lawyer, a man who had once dismissed her with a wave of his hand, now looked uneasy. He shifted in his seat, flipping through his notes, his face tightening as the teenager continued to expose the flaws in their argument. It was clear now that he hadn't expected her to be so thorough, so focused. The small doubts he'd had before were turning into a real challenge, and it was all unfolding in front of the judge and the entire courtroom. When she finished her explanation, the teenager stepped back, waiting for a response. She could see the tension in the room. The prosecution lawyer exchanged a quick glance with his colleague, then stood up. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "You've made some valid points," he said, though the words seemed forced. "But I still believe that the overall evidence points to the defendant's involvement in the incident. These discrepancies you mention are minor, and they don't change the fact that the teenager didn't let him finish." "With all due respect," she interjected, her voice measured but firm, "these discrepancies are not minor. They go to the heart of the case. We're talking about something that could have significant consequences for my future. And I think it's important that we don't overlook anything just because it's inconvenient." There was a brief silence as everyone absorbed her words. The prosecution lawyer seemed to hesitate, and for a moment the teenager thought he might back down. But instead, he squared his shoulders and tried again, though with less confidence. "I'm not saying we should overlook anything," he said, though his tone lacked the authority it had held earlier. "But the timeline is secondary to the fact that—" "I'm afraid I disagree," she cut in, her voice calm but resolute. "The timeline is everything. If the events happen in a different order, it changes everything. It changes the way the entire case should be interpreted. I'm not here to waste anyone's time, but I am here to make sure that the facts are understood as clearly as possible." The judge, who had been sitting quietly and observing, finally spoke. "I think we've heard enough on this issue for now," he said, his tone still professional but no longer dismissive. "I'm going to take a break so that everyone can review the evidence one more time. We'll reconvene in an hour." The teenager sat back down, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had done it again. She had held her ground even when the odds were against her. But she knew that this wasn't over yet. This was just one step in a much longer process. There were still questions to be answered, still arguments to be made. And she would be ready. As the break was called, the room slowly began to clear. People stood up, stretching and chatting in low voices. The lawyers huddled together, murmuring, looking at their notes. The teenager stayed seated, her thoughts turning inward. This was the moment where it could all go either way. The break had given everyone a chance to regroup, to prepare for the next phase of the hearing. But it also meant that whatever momentum she had built up could be lost if she didn't continue to press her case. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. This was a test of her patience, her focus. She had to keep her head clear. She couldn't afford to let the pressure of the situation cloud her thoughts. She had worked too hard, had come too far, to let it all slip away now. When the break ended, the room reconvened. The judge sat back down at the bench, and the proceedings continued. The teenager felt the weight of everyone's gaze on her again. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was real. This was it, the final stretch. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the return to the hearing. "Let's continue," he said, his voice firm but not unfriendly. "I've had time to review the points you raised, and I'm going to allow for further testimony." The teenager nodded, standing up again. She knew there was still more work to do, but she was ready. As she began to speak, she felt the weight of the moment settling into her bones. This wasn't just about proving she was right. It was about proving that everyone, regardless of age, deserved to be taken seriously. She had worked hard to earn that respect. Now it was time to show that she deserved it. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the proceedings moved into the final stages. It had been a long and drawn-out process, and though the teenager had made significant strides in challenging the assumptions against her, the final decision was still hanging in the balance. Everyone knew that today would determine the outcome of the case. The judge, once so confident and dismissive, was now looking at the teenager with a mixture of respect and curiosity. She had earned that respect not through flashy arguments or showmanship, but through quiet, methodical reasoning and an unwavering focus on the facts. The prosecution team had regrouped after the break, and now they were presenting their closing argument. It was clear that they were trying to regain their footing after the teenagers' impressive handling of the case. They were focused on the details they believed would tip the scales in their favor, but something about their presentation seemed a little less certain than it had before. The teenager could see it. The cracks were beginning to show. They had underestimated her, but now they had to face the reality that she wasn't going to back down. The prosecutor's voice echoed in the courtroom as he spoke, trying to put together the last pieces of their argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began, trying to sound confident, "we have presented clear evidence that the defendant was involved in the situation at hand. The timing of events, the testimony of witnesses, and the physical evidence all point in one direction. We believe the case is clear, and we ask the court to consider these facts when rendering its decision." The teenager sat still, her face calm and composed. She wasn't moved by his words. She had heard similar arguments before, and she knew that his presentation didn't change the truth. The facts hadn't changed. The inconsistencies were still there, the timeline was still off. And she knew that the truth had a way of rising to the surface. No matter how hard people tried to bury it, when the prosecutor finished, he gave a quick glance at the judge, then returned to his seat, his expression tight. The defense attorney spoke next, but his words didn't have the same weight as the teenagers. He focused on the technicalities of the case, talking about legal procedures and what the law required. While his words were important, they didn't have the impact that the teenagers had had. Her arguments were rooted in the facts that could not be ignored. The teenager's turn was next. She stood up, taking a deep breath before she spoke. There was no need to rush. She had been through this before. Her voice, though soft, had a quiet strength behind it that commanded attention. "Your Honor," she began, her words deliberate and clear, "thank you for the opportunity to speak again today. Over the past few weeks, we have examined the evidence, and I've tried my best to present the facts in the clearest way I know how. I understand that there are many details in this case, but I also know that if we step back and look at the big picture, it's clear that the conclusions drawn by the prosecution do not match the reality of what happened." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "The timeline of events is key, and it's not a small issue. It's the foundation on which the entire case rests. If we look closely, we see that the testimony from the witness isn't consistent with the physical evidence. We also see that the timing doesn't match up with the facts. And when you break down the statements made by the people involved, you start to see how those inconsistencies cannot be ignored." The courtroom was silent, all eyes on her. The judge was leaning forward slightly, clearly invested in what she was saying. The defense attorney, who had been mostly silent up until this point, glanced at her with a quiet admiration. Even the prosecution, who had been so confident earlier, seemed to be shifting in their seats, unsure of how to respond. "I'm not asking for anyone to ignore the law," the teenager continued. "What I'm asking is for us to take a moment and think about what we've learned. The facts don't add up. And because of that, I believe the case should be reconsidered. I don't want to waste anyone's time or drag this out longer than it has to be, but I do want to make sure that the truth is heard." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The judge sat back, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk, his expression unreadable. The room was still, and for the first time, the teenager felt like the momentum was truly in her favor. She had presented her case without anger, without bitterness. It was just the facts laid out clearly and thoughtfully. With the sole aim of ensuring that justice was done, the prosecutor stood up once more, looking a little more cautious this time. "Your Honor," he began, his voice lacking the usual confidence, "we understand the points the defendant has raised, but we still believe that the evidence overwhelmingly supports the prosecution's case. The witness testimony, the physical evidence, and the timeline all lead to the same conclusion. The defendant was involved in the situation." He paused, trying to regain some of his earlier composure. "We understand the defense's arguments, but we believe they don't change the overall picture of what happened. We ask that the court rule in favor of the prosecution." The judge didn't respond immediately. He sat quietly, flipping through his notes, processing everything that had been said. The room was quiet, the weight of the decision ahead pressing down on everyone. The teenager felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to the judge to decide. Finally, the judge spoke. "I've listened to both sides carefully," he said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "And I've reviewed all the evidence presented. I must say, the arguments made today have given me much to think about. The defense has raised some important points regarding the timeline and the inconsistencies in the witness testimony. These are not small issues. They deserve to be considered, and I believe that further investigation is warranted." The teenager's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say this. She had prepared herself for the possibility that things might not go in her favor. But hearing the judge acknowledge her points so directly, it was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The judge continued, "I believe that the case requires further examination before a final decision can be made. I'm going to order that the evidence be reevaluated in light of the defense's points. And I will also be requesting additional testimony from the witnesses involved. This case is too important to rush to judgment." The teenager couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but this was a huge victory. The judge had listened to her. He had considered her arguments. And most importantly, he had agreed with her that the evidence was not as clear-cut as it had first seemed. The judge gave a nod, signaling the end of the hearing. "This court is adjourned until further notice," he said, before standing up and walking away from the bench. The room slowly began to clear, but the teenager stayed seated for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. It wasn't over yet, but it was a significant step forward. She had proven that her voice mattered. She had shown that even though she was young, she was capable of understanding the law, the facts, and the importance of fairness in the courtroom. As the last few people filtered out of the room, the defense attorney approached her. He smiled warmly, a rare expression for someone in his position. "You did well," he said. "You've got a sharp mind, and you know how to make a case. I've got to hand it to you." The teenager nodded, though she didn't let herself get carried away by the compliment. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but it's not over yet. There's still a lot more work to be done." The attorney chuckled. "True, but I think you've already won something more important than the case. You've proven that you can stand up for what's right. That's something most people can't do, no matter their age." The teenager smiled, her confidence growing. "I guess we'll see how it all turns out." As she walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not because the case was over, but because she had stood her ground. She had faced the system, faced the doubt, and had forced people to listen. She had earned the respect of the judge, the lawyers, and most importantly herself. This wasn't the end of her story. But it was a beginning, a moment where she had proven that the truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, was worth fighting for. And as she walked out into the sunlight, she knew she was ready for whatever came next.